Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into how Britain was completely transformed during the 20th century. We're going to trace all the key events and big ideas that shaped the nation, from the trenches of World War I all the way to the political debates we're having today. This is all absolutely essential stuff for your life in the UK test.
So here's how we're going to break it down. We've got 5 key parts. We'll kick things off with the massive impact of the 2 world wars. Then we'll jump into the turbulent interwar years. After that, we'll see the creation of the welfare state, explore how Britain's identity went through a huge shift, and finally, we'll look at the recent challenges that have defined the nation. Let's get started.
Okay, let's start with the 2 world wars. And honestly, you really can't get a grip on modern Britain without first understanding just how profoundly these conflicts changed everything. They were like a crucible, forging a whole new nation in fire.
You know, we often hear that World War I started with just a single event, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But really, that was just the spark that lit the fuse. The real story? Well, it's all about these huge, combustible forces that had been building up for years, just waiting to turn a local crisis into a global catastrophe.
It was basically a perfect storm of 4 major forces all colliding at once. You had this intense nationalism fueling crazy rivalries. Then there was militarism, a massive arms race that meant every nation was basically ready and waiting for a fight. Imperialism added to the tension, with everyone competing for colonies. And finally, you had this tangled web of alliances that acted like a tripwire, guaranteeing that if 2 countries went to war, everyone else would get dragged in too.
The scale of the slaughter in this new type of industrial war was just on another level. I mean, think about this. On the very first day of the Battle of the Somme, there were 60,000 British casualties. 60,000. That staggering loss of life created this deep, powerful feeling that a sacrifice this huge couldn't be for nothing, and that really fueled demands for a fairer society once the war was over.
And it wasn't just on the battlefields of Europe that things were changing. Right here, closer to home, the war had dramatic political consequences. The plan for Irish Home Rule got completely derailed. The Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916 just intensified that push for independence, which led to a guerrilla war. And the result of all that? The partition of Ireland, which created Northern Ireland as part of the UK and the independent Irish Free State.
World War II, well, that's a story of survival and eventually victory, marked by some really critical turning points. In 1940, Britain was standing alone. Winston Churchill's absolute refusal to surrender rallied the whole nation. Then you have the near-miraculous evacuation from Dunkirk, which saved the army, and the RAF's incredible victory in the Battle of Britain, which stopped an invasion in its tracks. The tide really truly turned in 1944 with the D-Day landings in Normandy, which kicked off the liberation of Western Europe.
So what happened in between these 2 massive wars? Let's look at those interwar years. And this was a period of really deep contradictions, a time of both terrible hardship and incredibly exciting progress.
This slide really shows you the 2 completely different sides of Britain back then. On the one hand, you had the Great Depression, which just devastated old industries like coal and shipbuilding and led to mass unemployment. But on the other hand, brand new industries were booming. Car ownership literally doubled in the 1930s, and a whole new era of mass communication kicked off when the BBC was created in 1922.
So all this economic chaos got people thinking, there has to be a better way. An economist named John Maynard Keynes came along and challenged the old idea that government should just stay out of the economy. He argued that when things go bad, the government should actually step in and spend money to create jobs and get things moving again. This theory, Keynesianism, would go on to shape British economic policy for decades.
You know, after going through something as huge and traumatic as the Second World War together, there was this powerful feeling across the country that things could not go back to the way they were. The sacrifices people made, both on the battlefield and at home, created this massive demand for a new kind of society, one that offered security and fairness for everybody.
And that desire for a new social contract is what gave birth to what we call the welfare state. It's a really key concept. It's the principle that the government is responsible for the well-being of its citizens, providing support all the way from cradle to grave through things like healthcare, education, and social security.
And the NHS is the perfect example of how this happened. It wasn't a random event, it followed a very clear path. First, the shared sacrifice of the war created the public demand. Then, in 1942, the Beveridge Report laid out the actual blueprint for it. The landslide election victory for the Labour Party in 1945 provided the political power to make it happen. And finally, in 1948, the National Health Service was born, providing healthcare for all, totally free at the point of use.
All right, so the war ends. The welfare state is being built. But that is not all that was changing. Britain's whole identity, both at home and in the world, was about to be completely remade as the empire came to an end and the very makeup of society began to change.
In 1960, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan just perfectly captured the mood with his famous Wind of Change speech. He was basically acknowledging a new reality. The British Empire was ending. The whole process of decolonization, which had already seen India and Pakistan become independent in 1947, was picking up speed, completely reshaping Britain's role in the world.
Now, as Britain was trying to rebuild after the war, it had a big problem: not enough workers. So the government looked to the Commonwealth and actively started recruiting people to work in places like the transport system and the brand new NHS. This wave of migration, especially from the Caribbean, India, and Pakistan, was the beginning of the diverse multicultural society that defines Britain today. And then came the 1960s, a full-on cultural earthquake. The swinging 60s was an era of incredible social liberation. British music just exploded onto the world stage, led by bands like the Beatles. But this revolution was about so much more than music and fashion. It was a time of massive legal reform, with new laws that liberalized divorce and abortion, and landmark legislation to push for equal pay and to fight racial discrimination.
Okay, so we're heading into the final stretch of the 20th century. And this is where that big post-war agreement on how to run the country, well, it starts to fall apart. This ushers in a new era of economic problems, radical political shifts, and a very complex, always changing relationship with Europe.
The economic crises of the 1970s, with soaring inflation and constant strikes, really paved the way for Margaret Thatcher's election in 1979. Her government brought in a radical change of direction. That post-war trend of nationalizing industries was thrown into reverse, with huge state-owned companies like telecoms and gas being sold off or privatized. New laws were brought in to limit the power of trade unions, and the whole country was reoriented towards a free market economy.
This timeline really captures the huge political moments of the last 50 years or so. In 1973, Britain joined what was then the European Economic Community, tying its future to the continent. Decades later, in 1998, the historic Good Friday Agreement finally brought an end to the long conflict in Northern Ireland. And of course, more recently, Britain's relationship with Europe was completely redrawn by the 2016 vote to leave the EU, which led to the formal departure in 2020.
So, when you look back at everything we've talked about, what's the one big takeaway for your test? It's this: the incredible shock of 2 world wars was the main engine for almost every major change that happened. That shared sacrifice created the demand for a better, fairer society, and that led directly to things like the welfare state and the NHS, which have shaped the Britain we all live in today. And understanding this wild century of transformation, this whole story of conflict, consensus, and constant change, well, it helps us think about what's happening right now and what might come next. The last 100 years were shaped by the catalyst of war. The question for us now is, what will be the next great catalyst that shapes the next 100?